Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Value podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Maggie Bryson. She has a PhD in Near Eastern Studies and Egyptology, which she received from Johns Hopkins University. And today we'll be discussing the Exodus. Is it based on any sort of historical fact, or is it entirely a myth, top to bottom? So thank you for joining me today, Maggie Bryson.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Thank you for joining me. Is there any evidence at all for a historical exodus?
Straight to the point. I like that. The problem I have, so I don't think it's a bad question. I think it's a good question. But the problem that I have with framing it that way is that you have to set up what you mean by an exodus. If you are talking about a biblical literalist exodus, if you are, just in the pure plain sense of the text, then the answer is no. The idea that hundreds of thousands, millions of people could have left Egypt in one event, basically in a single night, and then spent the next 40 years traveling together as an organized group, eventually invading Canaan, again, all at one sort of single historical moment, is not supported by the evidence, nor is the idea, and this is even more important, I think, to get out right up front, that there was a people resident in Egypt who would have thought of themselves as a unified people, called themselves Israelites even, right? Because by the time the Israelites are in Egypt in the Bible, they are Israelites, right? Their patriarch is called Israel. There's no evidence for that either. And the things that are the hallmarks of Israelite society, right? The shared identity, the shared sort of tribal identity, if you will, the set of religious laws, and what ultimately becomes a monotheistic faith are not present in Canaanite populations in Egypt, to the best of anyone's ability to tell, sort of from any of the evidence that's available to us. So that's the sort of long/short answer to that question.
Is there any evidence of ancient Israelites in ancient Egypt at all?
Again, it depends very much on what you mean by Israelites. The idea that people who contributed in some way to the development of what becomes the historical Israel, either the kingdom, so the nation state, or the people, the ethnic group, that the ancestors of those people could have been in Egypt at some point, or some of their ancestors, some component of what becomes Israel could have been in Egypt at some point, is not at all out of the question. There were people from the Eastern Mediterranean region, from Syria, Palestine, what is now the state of Israel, Lebanon, all the way down into the Negev desert. There are people from those regions, and also the desert regions, sort of the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, and the eastern part of the Egyptian desert. People from all of those kind of peripheral regions moved in and out of Egypt over the course of, many hundreds of years, thousands of years even. So there are people from the Near East going to Egypt, and those people were, in some instances, enslaved in Egypt. In other instances, they served very high positions in the Egyptian government. There was a vizier in the reign of Amenhotep III, whose name seems to have been Abdi-El, right, the servant of the god El. He seems to have been of Canaanite ancestry, to the extent that it's actually, commemorated in his name. But were these people Israelites? That's the problem, right? Abdi-El was buried in an Egyptian tomb in the Egyptian style, with references to the Egyptian gods all over the walls, right? There is no indication that there was anything distinctive about his religious views from the ancient perspective, right? They're all living in a world where, your name might, be a theophoric, right? A name that uses the name of a god, a theophoric Ale name, but that doesn't bar you from, acknowledging or even worshiping other gods, which is very much out of keeping with how we understand this sort of core of Israelite identity. There's there's no indication. The word Israel is not used, with respect to anyone before, at the very earliest, sometime in the 18th dynasty, and certainly, right, the reign of Manetho, sometime around 1200 BCE, is the first time we hear about any group of people called Israel. They're in Canaan at that point. So if you want to look for evidence of the Exodus, you have to set up what you mean by the Exodus. If you want to look for evidence of Israelites in Egypt, you have to set up what you mean by Israelites. And again, in the plain sense of the biblical text, in the plain sense of the term, right, what we understand an Israelite to be, that evidence is just not there.
So, in other words, regardless of how one sets up what they mean by Israelites or the Exodus, it's very complicated and it's difficult to find evidence whatsoever, regardless of how one describes either of them.
Well, if what you want an Israelite to be, right? If you are content to think of the Exodus as something that could be in some ways like what's described in the Hebrew Bible, but isn't exactly that. So, like, there are Egyptian papyri that talk about people escaping past checkpoints and back into the desert. So back, they escape to the east, they escape back toward Canaan through checkpoints in the desert. And in some ways that might recall, right? They're in Egypt, either, enslaved or in some way, restricted in their movements. And they get loose and they head back toward, the Levine. If you're okay with that, if you're okay with the Exodus story in the Hebrew Bible being a kind of elaboration, being a collection of a lot of different small scale events that happened over the course of a long period of time, if you're okay with that, then yes, you could say, right, that there are reflections in the Egyptian record of what comes to be the tradition of the Exodus. But if it's important to you to believe that there was a unified people who would have called themselves the sons of Israel, or in some way identified as descendants of a patriarch Israel, ultimately a patriarch Abram, that they were living in Egypt at a single point in time, that they all came from the same place, they all had the same origins, they all went to the same place after they left Egypt. If that's important to you, then no, there isn't support in the Egyptian record for that. Because people, I find, tend to be kind of inconsistent. Even the same person, right, can be very inconsistent in what constitutes evidence for the Exodus for them, because how they're thinking about the Exodus isn't necessarily really focused. It's not necessarily a developed picture. They haven't necessarily thought through all of the different things that would have to be true in order for any given piece of evidence to support or not support the event that they're looking for. And I've heard people who describe themselves as biblical fundamentalists or even biblical literalists say that they're okay with some compromises in terms of how you reconstruct, of what the actual historical event they're looking for would be. So, for instance, if you add up the numbers, right, what's the date of the Exodus? What do you know? When did the Exodus happen?
Well, according to the Book of Kings, it tries to say it's 1446 BCE if one takes that seriously.
Right. So if you add up the numbers in the sort of historical books, right, and from starting in Exodus and into the Deuteronomistic history, you wind up with a date around 1450 BCE. Conservatively, right? It depends on the length of the period when Israel was ruled by judges. For example, right? There isn't a number for the length of time of the period of the judges, but a conservative estimate would be somewhere around 1450 BCE. Hoffmeyer has actually come up with an even earlier date, but by sort of, doing a good year count. But exactly, right? That number, there is right? That is one thing. That's one point of information. And so you have to start somewhere. And so if you say, okay, 1450 BCE, the only evidence you can look at is going to be evidence that's relevant to that date. People are comfortable, it seems, with saying, well, that date is not actually meant to be read literally, right? The Exodus is true. It's real history. It's important, right? I'm a scriptural literalist. I'm really invested in this, but it's okay for the Exodus to actually have happened in the 13th century BCE. Right? Because of things like the fact that the Israelites are supposed to have built the city of Ramses, which couldn't have existed before the 13th century BCE, because that's the first time that there is a king of Egypt named Ramses. So where you're comfortable moving those sliders, right? If you are somebody who is very invested in the Bible, who is a fundamentalist, I've heard, the reason I use the word fundamentalist here is that I've heard people describe themselves as fundamentalists and then say the Bible could place the Exodus in the 13th century BCE. Okay, well, if we make that shift, then what does that force us to look for one thing? And then what also does that allow us to be flexible about in terms of how we reconstruct the Exodus? Okay, well, there's no evidence for 2 million people leaving Egypt en masse in the 13th century BCE. Maybe it wasn't 2 million. Maybe it was 200,000. Maybe it was 20,000. Maybe it was 200. Maybe it was 20. How far are you willing to move that slider in order to get an Exodus that matches some body of evidence from Egypt in the New Kingdom period? Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it does. What do you make of the claim that some make that the Hyksos expulsion was the basis for the Exodus myth?
If you look at the Exodus myth as something that does reflect historical truth in some way, the idea that the Hyksos myth should be a part of that, or the Hyksos episode, right? The Hyksos domination of Egypt should be part of that, I think is highly plausible, frankly. Because when you look at all of the different ways, like the Hebrew Bible, the Exodus is not the only place, it's not the only point of contact between Egypt and Canaan in the Hebrew Bible, between Egypt and the Israelites. It goes back to not just the patriarchs, right? The Egyptians are put in their place in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, right, as descendants of Ham, the son of Noah. They're part of the world picture. And, Abram and Sarah go to Egypt, and then much later in the period of the monarchy, the Israelites, in a historical period for which we do have very solid evidence, are interacting with, tangling with the Egyptians. Right? Egypt dominated Canaan for most of the Bronze Age, to some degree, right? Depending on the period, right? The earlier you go, or the sort of at the early end or the late end, you're not dealing with a systematic kind of colonization. But in the New Kingdom period, the time when the Exodus is set, either the early date or the late date of the Exodus is set, Egypt has permanent garrisons, or at least long-term military garrisons in territory that later comes to be a part of this Israelite state. So, there's extended back and forth contact, sometimes friendly and sometimes conflictual, between Egyptians and people from the Levant, including Canaan, including what becomes Israel. And the Hyksos episode is a big part of that, right? This is a period when people from Syria, Palestine are ruling Egypt. People whose ancestors are from that region and who still maintain an identity rooted in that region are ruling Egypt. So, and of course, right, we have the Joseph story. We have this, and this idea, right, that's built into the Exodus narrative of how the Egyptians were threatened by the Israelites because they were becoming so numerous, they were becoming so successful. And so they had to, in some way, control them, demean them, right, break them down to prevent them from being a threat. So the idea that the Hyksos period, the Hyksos episode, could be part of that memory is not far-fetched at all. I mean, I think But if you wanted to say, could the Hyksos episode have been the Exodus that is described in the book of Exodus, there I would have to stop you and say, I don't see how. Again, there is no indication that the Hyksos considered themselves something like the Israelites, right? Something like the cohesive, and tribally cohesive, right? That the Hyksos would have traced their ancestry back to a single patriarch or to a group of patriarchs. That they were even notionally committed to a religion, a special relationship with a single God, the way that the Israelites are described. There's no indication, ultimately that they all arrived as part of a single process in Egypt, although, recent studies are kind of, in fact, recent studies are kind of showing that it seems to have been a more gradual infiltration through, at least in part, sort of trade type relationships, intermarriage, a more, it's not that a single family was kidnapped and brought there, and that's what established the Hyksos presence. It's, and in fact, right, when the Hyksos are driven out, it's not that they are an enslaved group. It's that they are military leaders, right? They're effectively ruling the country at that time. The picture isn't a perfect match, but the idea that it could be part of some memory of a time when Israelites were numerous and powerful and the Egyptians felt threatened is not at all out of the question. And, it's really instructive, I think, to think about that. But the thing is, it's not the only time things like that happened either. There seems to have been conflict within Egypt with people in that area of Avaris. So, like the reign of Amenhotep II is a famous period, right? There is a period where Avaris, there seems to be some animus against people of Canaanite origin in the reign of, on the part of Amenhotep II. And, based on his royal inscriptions. And there is this, and the city of Avaris is temporarily uninhabited, in that later Thutmose period. So do we have a perfect match? No. Is it possible that there's some component of memory there? Yes, would be my response to that question.
What are your thoughts on Manetho's version of the Exodus story?
And again, and I sometimes wonder if people have thought this through reading Manetho. Even, and again, when we talk about reading Manetho, we're talking mostly about the account we have of what he said given by Flavius Josephus in Contra Appionem. So, or against Appian, right? Even there, you have to ask which Exodus. Because Josephus actually is dealing with the same, Josephus has a similar picture to the one we have. And Josephus notes in Contra Appionem, right, that Manetho describes the Hyksos episode in his History of Egypt, and then later describes another event in the 18th dynasty, right, some time down the road, where the Egyptians come into conflict with a group of people and drive them out of Egypt into Syria, Palestine, into Canaan. And Josephus is saying Manetho got it wrong. He picked the wrong Exodus. If you take a look at Against Appian, you'll see, right? Josephus talks about the Hyksos event, and Josephus says, I think that's what the Exodus was. I'm almost positive. His explanation is that Moses lived in the time of the Hyksos, that he gloriously led his people out of Egypt, in that historical context. And in a way, right, when you think about it, it's more flattering to the Jewish people of Josephus's time to think of their ancestors in Egypt as having, first of all, been native to Canaan originally, having come to Egypt, having risen to prominence enough to the point that they were ruling the country, and then having been forced back by these, rebellious Egyptian subjects who felt threatened, who felt jealous, ultimately. That's a more flattering picture of the origins of the Jewish people. The later episode, the Osarsev myth, the story that Egyptian lepers, and outcasts banded together and were, and rebelled against the Egyptians, from the city of Avaris, notably, and then were driven out, is a much less flattering picture. And Josephus points out that fact. And he basically is accusing Manetho of anti-Semitism. Because the episode that Manetho was looking to as the roots of the Exodus, as the roots of the origin of Israel in Canaan via Egypt, is this unflattering picture of lepers and outcasts and rebellious paupers, as opposed to these kind of noble conquerors, who bootstrapped their way to rule the country. And so it's an absolutely fascinating account, because another thing that it reveals is that even in the 1st century CE, when Josephus is writing, people wanted to know, was the Exodus real? And if so, when did it happen? They wanted to know where the Jewish people came from. I think that, and this is just my sense, having looked at the preserved parts of Manetho and Josephus's account of them and things like that, there seems to be some unclarity in the Egyptian records for the 18th dynasty. And it's funny because Josephus actually calls out, so the King Horus, right, that's one of the characters in the leper story, the Osiris story. Josephus says, Manetho made him up. He's fictitious. He's out of place in the historical sequence. The chronology is wrong. There's no other indication that he was real. And that fact alone shows me that even at that time, they had a kind of difficult time sorting out the Egyptian evidence and figuring out how to relate it to the origin story of Israel. In terms of, Josephus reading against Apion sounds a whole lot like engaging in a modern discussion of the historicity of the Exodus in many ways. Right down to the fact that anti-Semitism comes into play. I've actually had people, who were Jewish and observant and traditionally educated, come to me and say, when you say that the Exodus didn't happen, regardless of what you intend it to sound like, it sounds to me a little bit like Holocaust denialism, because the Exodus is so important to Jewish identity. I've actually had a young person say that to me, and I thought it was a really interesting and important observation, because they weren't accusing me of anti-Semitism in a pointed way. But I can see where scholars coming on and really just hammering home this point, the Exodus isn't real, it never happened, there's not a shred of evidence, and just, dwelling on that point over and over again, could come across as a little bit hostile toward the Jewish people, right? To people who identify as, to whom Judaism is so important as a part of their identity, just because, right, there is that other history there. And again, Josephus is saying the same thing. He's saying other people are trying to tell me what my Jewish history should be. They're trying to tell me what my origins are as a Jew. I don't think they're right, and I think they're hostile in doing so. So it's a really fascinating read if you go into Against Apion, but again, I think Josephus commits the same error that a lot of modern people do, a lot of modern historians or sort of people who are interested in history commit in trying to pin something down that you can't really pin. For him, it was the Hyksos. He was like, that has to be it. The data all line up. But again, I don't think they line up perfectly. I think that would have been evident even in Josephus's time, or it would have been a point that you could have made even in Josephus's time with the evidence available. It's just that in Josephus's time, I don't mean to cut you off. Did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Even in Josephus's time, when I say even in Josephus's time, in his time, it seems too that there were other Exodus stories circulating. So Josephus certainly knew the book of Exodus as we know it. He knew the Exodus story. But in his history of the Jews, Josephus talks about sort of events or episodes in Moses' life that aren't in the book of Exodus. Like Moses leads, he gets engaged in military conflict with the Ethiopians. He takes an Ethiopian wife, right? And by this we mean Nubian, right? It's presumably someone from the Sudan, modern day Sudan. And Josephus does not mention in his history, his account of the Exodus, the episode, for instance, of the murder of the Egyptian, and Moses going on the lam in Midian. So there seem to have been, and notably, and another thing that's really interesting to note is that Josephus often describes, sort of talks about how the Israelites left Egypt and went into Judea and established the city of Jerusalem. And later, right, and a lot of Hellenistic, or at least a couple of Hellenistic historians, attributed the founding of the city of Jerusalem to Moses, right, taking it as kind of the next episode in the journey out of Egypt after the Exodus. Even in the Book of Kings, right, even the Hebrew Bible itself doesn't, has already dispensed with that notion in the version we have, right? Jerusalem is a Jebusite city, and it doesn't become incorporated into Israelite territory until the reign of David. So the Hellenistic period is a period when the canon is just becoming fixed, and there are still a lot of traditions, a lot of stories, possibly even in written form, that are not accessible to us, that would have informed Josephus's picture of the Exodus, is the sense that I get, at least.
What do you make of the claim that the Shasu of Yah are Israelites?
This is another one that I think of very much like I think of the Hyksos. So the Shasu of Yah, right, the people that you're talking about, are a group of desert nomads that the Egyptians interacted with in the New Kingdom period, and they're known primarily from the Amenhotep III temple, a couple of Amenhotep III temples in Nubia. And all we have about them in those temples is their name. They're called the Shasu of Yah, or Yahu, which seems to be a place. So they are Shasu, that is desert nomads from a place. And again, the Shasu are usually from that eastern desert, up into Canaan sort of geographic continuum. So the Shasu of Yah, or Yahu, are a group of people who, the term Yah, right, we just don't know, right? Because obviously the word Yah, it's so suggestive that in this period that's supposed to be, according to the Hebrew Bible, formative for Israel, right, in the very period when God's name is revealed to Moses as Yahweh, and right, because of course that's the sort of big thing that happens. One of the big things that happens to Moses before the Exodus is when he, what comes out of that burning bush is the true identity of God as Yahweh. The idea that there could have been a group of people in the eastern desert, right, who identified themselves as being from, or who could be described as being from Yah or of Yah, is hugely compelling on its face. And I think it's really interesting. And again, I think there could be some kernel of historical truth there. There could be some, right, because Moses goes to Midian, right, in the northern part of the Arabian desert, after he finds out, or when he finds out the name of God, right? He's in northern Arabia. He's in something that you might be able to characterize as Shasu land. And when he finds out that name of God as Yahweh. So is there some way in which Egypt acted as a crucible for different groups of people, right? A group of people who are known by the time of Manetho as Israel, a group of people who live in a place perhaps called Yah, but could, and again, the name of the god could be connected to the place, right? Is Yah the god of this place where these Shasu originate? Is there some way in which the fact that Egypt is a place where people go for refuge, they go there, sometimes they're taken there against their will, right? So a lot of times nomads would, the idea is that nomads would come to the Nile Valley to water their animals, right? In times when there was drought. The desert environment becomes even more dry, right? There's just nowhere to feed or water your animals. They would come to Egypt looking for sustenance, right? Egypt is a place where agriculture is consistent and steady for the most part, So people come there. They come there looking for opportunities, right? They immigrate looking for opportunities. is there a way in which Egypt is a crucible in the New Kingdom period for ideas about God and identity among people who speak Semitic languages and live, perhaps even outside of the sort of settled city-state system that's, reflected in the Amarna letters, for instance? I don't think you can entirely rule that out. And the idea that the Israelites of the Iron Age, the Israelites of the 6th century BCE and after, could have some traditions, some memory, some idea of, a period that by then would have been, several centuries behind them, is not out of the question. Or oral tradition can be very persistent. But it doesn't seem to be the case necessarily that these traditions are being transmitted, that these ideas, these histories are being transmitted verbatim, the same way that, like for instance, the Vedas might be, are transmitted, or, the Torah or the Quran are memorized and transmitted word for word. There certainly seems to be some kind of, vagueness or mutability about these stories, because they never do quite seem to want to line up with any specific evidentiary picture from archaeology or from Egyptian texts. But the Shasu of Yah, there is an article by Thomas Schneider, an Egyptologist, about a Book of the Dead. And in that Book of the Dead is a name that translated means something like "My Lord is the Shepherd of Yah," as though somebody who, and again, it's an uncertain, sort of a slightly uncertain translation, I think, and Schneider's careful in this art. It's a few years old now. But the idea that somebody from this context, right, of wherever Yah is, that people like that were moving into Egypt, were assimilating into Egyptian society on some level, and then might have encountered hostility in Egypt and left, is, in no way out of the question. But notably, again, are we talking about Israelites? Really don't think so. Because this is a Book of the Dead. It is a document that is designed to help empower you in the Egyptian afterlife, in the sight of the Egyptian gods. It is not a document for henotheists who are committed to a Canaanite god, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What do you make of the claim that the Habiru are the Hebrews and are therefore the Israelites?
Again, so the etymology of the word Hebrew is not clear, nor is the etymology of the word Habiru, the Akkadian word that we know so well from the Amarna letters, but of course also occurs elsewhere. What the Habiru or Apiru are seems to be stateless people who are committed to making trouble, right, for the settled city-states of Canaan and elsewhere in the Bronze Age. They're marauders, they're sort of mobile warlords with their retinues. If you think about the story of King David, and Kyle McCarter is kind of the classic, wrote the sort of the classic account of this, right? And he's sort of the classic advocate or exponent of this idea. The story of King David, who, to be clear, before he becomes king of Israel, lives on the run as a mercenary. He works for the Philistines. He is an Apiru. He is a Habiru, effectively. Right? His career sounds a little bit like, that of Idrami of Alalach. He's kind of the clear heir, the chosen successor, but he faces, hostility and is driven out into the wilderness, where he assembles a rugged band of warriors and eventually is able to retake his birthright. Right? In David's case, it's his right of birth through God's decree, but he's able to retake his rightful position. Maybe he did some things in between that he's not proud of, but I think, it's a really interesting, right? The overlap there, the overlay that you can make is really compelling. But the idea that the Apiru phenomenon the existence of these sort of stateless groups, well-armed stateless groups, does not account for everything about the Exodus story. It doesn't account for the sort of the degree to which the Israelites are connected to Egypt in this period, right? Moses is not a renegade up until the point where he commits murder, right? He is part of the Egyptian royal family. And Moses, to be clear, again, he goes Habiru to some degree. You could say he goes Habiru. He flees the Egyptian court because he's been accused of murder, and he lives out in the desert for a while, and puts together a family and a retinue, and eventually comes back. He is a reflection of that, but anybody could have been in those days. It's a trope, a kind of literary trope. But this idea that you have this whole settled population of Israelites in Egypt, that their genesis is as a family that grows large and prosperous under these settled conditions, doesn't really line up all that well with the Apiru or Habiru model. It's one of those things that, again, it feels like it's right there on at the tip of your fingers, like it's just right beyond your reach. Or it feels like there's some shadow or some remnant of history there, but it doesn't line up perfectly, if at all. And again, the idea that all of this is taking place at a single historical moment is also problematic, right? The Egyptians, some of the best evidence for interactions between Egypt and Canaan comes from the Middle Bronze Age, from Egypt's Middle Kingdom period. That we have like the tomb painting of Beni Hassan that shows the group of Asiatics who've come bearing tribute according to the Egyptians, but possibly on a trade mission. It's and that's 1800 BCE, something like that. The Exodus 1500, maybe 1200. Right? There's a very long story here, and the Exodus is told. The question of when, and again, the time in which Joseph and his family come to Egypt, you can also calculate from biblical dates. And you can come up with a couple of different numbers, right? The long sojourn versus the short sojourn. It's a lot of it is a matter of sort of figuring out where you want to put the playing pieces on that chessboard, because there are a lot of possibilities. More like a Go board, maybe. In some ways, with just, seemingly endless assortments and reassortments.
What about Pharaoh Akhenaten? Was he really a monotheist? And is there any real evidence his deity, the Aten, is connected to the origins of Judaism at all?
That's another really tough one, because so Akhenaten, again, we're talking about the 14th century BCE. There is certainly something different, something unique about Akhenaten's theology. And Akhenaten's religious program is not a complete unicum. It's not something that just appeared out of nowhere. There is a tendency earlier in the New Kingdom to kind of recognize multiple gods potentially as aspects of a single divine being. So there's kind of a centralizing syncretistic trend in Egyptian religion, specifically around the sun god, in the generations leading up to Akhenaten, and it persists after that. Syncretism, so the idea that the sort of lumping and splitting of gods, the idea that one god can have many aspects, or that many different gods can all actually be one, or one god can have many different identities, right? A god can have a lot of different names, a lot of different appearances, is built into Egyptian religion from an early date. And it's also built into Canaanite religion, to be clear. So is Akhenaten a monotheist? He's as close as the ancient world gets to, I think, the idea that there is a kind of single omnipotent divine principle, and the imagery around the Aten, the idea that, it gives life to everything, right? That its rays are the one thing that can give life, that at night when it's gone, because the Aten is the solar disk, right? It's the sun in its disk form. It doesn't even have a human shape like most of the Egyptian gods do, or an animal form. the idea that the Aten is all powerful, it's the source of everything, and that its authority extends, right? The circuit of the Aten, right? Everything that the sun touches is within its realm of authority. It's the all powerful being. Comes close to monotheism, the way we think of it. Egyptian society as a whole, it didn't take. If Akhenaten was a monotheist, right? And it's not clear that he was, right? Because like the god Harakti, right? The identity of the sun god as Harakti, persists into Akhenaten's reign. Right? And that's the sort of falcon form, right? Harakti of the sun god. It's not a pure monotheism in the sense that there are a lot of different ways in which, there are multiple ways in which the sun god could be expressed. Akhenaten's effacement, his destruction of images of other gods, wasn't universal. It was kind of, sporadic throughout the country, whether that was for practical reasons, like they just didn't get to everything in the, close to 20 years he was on the throne, or it's because he didn't actually want to shutter all of the gods' temples, only the ones that were sort of in his way politically. Is sort of, a point that's been debated. But Akhenaten, the language of like the Great Hymn to the Aten, it recalls passages in the Hebrew Bible. And again, the idea of Egypt as a crucible, a place where the idea of a single omnipotent God with a royal representative on it, right? Because Akhenaten really made himself the head of the Egyptian religious apparatus, right? He really did emphasize his sort of priestly role, his role as an officiant in temples, his role as the only human being who could serve as a point of contact between his people and God, right? So there's this he sort of elevates the royal role. So you have this powerful king, or would-be powerful king, right? Akhenaten's actual, he's meets with opposition at home. Egypt's sort of influence abroad wanes during his reign, but he wants to be this sort of absolute monarch with an absolute relationship with God. That idea of a single omnipotent divine being with a single earthly representative, a chosen king on earth, also, seems the Davidic kingship kind of seems to echo that in a way that could be more than coincidental. But it doesn't account for everything. It's not the only thing that's involved here. It is not the whole picture. And in historical fact, the Israelites do not adopt a monotheistic religion in the late Bronze Age. Even if there is a centralizing, a unifying tendency, right? If there's a henotheistic, right? Henotheistic means elevating one god above other gods, as opposed to denying that any gods apart from one exist or have any real influence. Even if there's a henotheistic tendency in some populations, so like the Temple of Hathor in the Sinai, right? There's evidence that there's like this standing stone, the shrine with standing stones, and the destruction of images of the Egyptian gods. Even if there are pockets of that aniconic, henotheistic type of worship, in Canaan, in Israel, at sites that are later clearly identified as Israelite settlements where Israelite worship was conducted, they have at least a consort for God, Asherah, right? There's at least a goddess in the picture. And there's no clear indication that there was an expectation at that time that Israelites should be monotheists or even henotheists. So in the heart of what becomes the state of Israel, people are still apparently practicing something that is, at least, a god-goddess type of religion, and probably, just generally participating in a really polytheistic religious milieu and worldview. And not to be clear, because the Deuteronomistic history is very clear about this. Yeah, absolutely. Tons of Israelites were worshiping Canaanite gods. They weren't supposed to, and they knew it. Right? That's the argument in the Deuteronomistic history. The archaeological picture looks much more like the Israelites were worshiping as Canaanites, not in defiance of God, but because they didn't know they weren't supposed to. That was just what you did. That's what religion was. And it's possible that over time, as other elements, as their kingdom develops, as they interact with other societies and cultures, and new ideas filter in, certain strands get pulled, right? Certain threads get pulled, and one of those threads is the Yahwistic monotheist thread, and that's what comes to dominate in Judah, not in the late Bronze Age, right? Not at the very end of the late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age, when the Exodus is supposed to have happened, but a few hundred years later, at a time when the Davidic monarchy is well established, even when the northern kingdom is fallen, right? When Assyria has already conquered Israel. So it's so tantalizing. It's like, yes, the Aten really seems to be in some way related to the biblical concept of God, right? There's so many parallels that you can see, but it doesn't line up well with the history. Of course, then we have to ask the question of where do these similarities come from? If Israelite religion, as it's described in the Hebrew Bible, only dates to the late Iron Age, where do all these memories, these shadows of the late Bronze Age, come from? How was that knowledge preserved, if it was? How and why was it incorporated into Israelite culture and religion in the Iron Age? And that's a question that I don't think anybody has a satisfactory answer for. But yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Maggie Bryson.
You're very welcome. I hope I hope it was useful.
I certainly thought it was. Thanks again.
Take care.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.